to understand how I got to gender and Jim Crow, I think it's important for me to talk about uh, my master's thesis at UNC Charlotte. It was called Agrarian Unrest and Urban Remedies. It was, of course, as you might suspect, about populism. And it basically was the 1890s in North Carolina. In that state, the Democrats and the Democratic Party and the Populist Party fused. So they were the fusionists. And I wrote about how they fought this sort of whole new industrial regime, money, gold, etc. And I featured two people, Charles Aycock, who would later become governor, and Josephus Daniels, who was the editor of the News and Observer. I did include the part in which there was a race riot in Wilmington in 1898 and disfranchisement of African Americans in 1900, but I had no Black actors in the entire thing. And I didn't paint Charles Aycock and Josephus Daniels as such bad guys. They went on to be the members of a vicious triumvirate with another guy who condoned the Wilmington Massacre, who disfranchised African Americans in 1900. So I was reading an article in graduate school that had a brief mention at Chapel Hill. After doing that master's, it had a brief mention of Black women showing up in 1920 at the polls. And I was actually gobsmacked, dumbfounded, because that wouldn't happen in the North Carolina that I had just written about. And so I determined that I would try for my dissertation to figure out how they got to those polls. And I decided to go back to about 1896, before their husbands and sons and fathers were disfranchised, and see how they built a political culture. I knew I couldn't go to the Southern Historical Collection because that's the archive of all the white supremacists, but at least I had that part written in my master's thesis. Now I could flip it, and I wrote a dissertation that was the polar opposite of that. The problem was sources. It is difficult to describe now what it was like before any digitization, microfilm, and there were scant African American history archives. So I didn't know how to do it. I was still living in Charlotte, commuting to Chapel Hill, and I remembered that the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church headquarters for the whole country were on the street that I went down every day. So I stopped and I went in and said, "Do you guys have any records or anything I could look at?" And they said, "No, but we just microfilmed our newspaper, The Star of Zion, and we put it at the Charlotte Public Library. There was a copy there and a copy at the University of Chicago that I think John Hope Franklin got." And so I went there, sat down, mounted the 1896 reel, shut my eyes, pressed the button, unpressed the button, opened my eyes, and there were these words: "Some say that woman is good in her place. That reminds me of what white people say of the Negro, that he is good in his place." And those were the first words of Sara Dudley Pettey's first ever woman's column in the Star of Zion. I reflect now, it was a slim thread, but boy, did I cling to it. I think that the reason I became a narrative historian and focus on biography of the characters is that there weren't records, there weren't copious manuscripts. I had to find people's lives to tell this story. And I found those lives under people's beds and scrapbooks and photograph albums in back rooms and closets at historically Black universities that, where they'd never had the money to catalog things. And by talking to people, I eventually became friendly with Sara Dudley Pettey's granddaughter. But the whole point of this research was that I saw then a different North Carolina than the one I had grown up with and that my family had, on both sides, had lived in for 8 generations. I began to see things differently. The last story I'll tell you about this is about Charlotte Hawkins Brown. She is the woman I eventually learned as I was doing the research who organized Black women to turn out at the polls when women's suffrage passed in 1920. And she was the president of Palmer Institute, which was a sort of high school, first years of college institute near Greensboro, where I grew up. And I realized suddenly that I had met her several times when I was a child. My grandfather was her doctor, and he, unlike a lot of other white doctors, treated Black patients, but segregation was the law. And so he put up a glass wall between the white and the Black waiting rooms. Well, she wouldn't do that. So I hung out at the clinic a lot as a child. What she would do is go to the back in her chauffeur-driven Black car, and my grandfather's secretary would come out and open the car door and say, "Welcome, Dr. Brown, come into the doctor's office." And I knew this and I had completely forgotten it until I had started writing about her. So I think that what happened with gender and Jim Crow is that things that had been abstract to me politically became deeply personal about my family, about how we could have overlooked Black participation, and really gave me the passion and the stridency that I needed to make my points.